Welcome to Mr. Rodman's Top 12 Highlights from Chapter 5. We're going to look at ideologies in the American political landscape according to what we see in America today. How do we define all of these voters in the electorate? The ones that stay home, the ones that go vote, the elections that are won or lost in the middle, Downs theory of rational choice, those moderate voters. How do we define them? We're going to look at that in this chapter, Chapter 5. Let's start off by talking about political efficacy, what we talked about kind of at the end of the last chapter, the idea of citizens being able to understand how politics works, how political events shape their society, and internal efficacy, the idea of what we can do as a result of it. How can I take action? The reason why the Maryland General Assembly requires we teach government in Maryland, and being able to know what I can do to actually make a difference. And then external efficacy, how can government respond to the needs of the people? Like in Hurricane Harvey, how can government respond to dealing with what the people need and reacting to that to make sure that their needs are met? The wildfires in the West, the hurricanes in the south and in the Gulf Coast, whatever it is that's going on, earthquakes in Oklahoma or wherever disaster strikes, being able to respond to the needs of the people is really that external efficacy we're talking about there. So important in terms of understanding politics and the American political landscape, because how the government responds can lead people to react in different ways, and this is really important here. Do we have a high internal external efficacy? Well, the idea here is we often have a low external efficacy. We really don't want the government to respond to our needs on a regular basis. It's only when disaster strikes. But we do have a very powerful internal efficacy. The idea that I talked about in class, where Europeans don't have a strong internal efficacy, but they vote. We don't tend to vote as much because we got to stay home and wash the cat. We'll come up with every reason why we don't need to go vote, but we'll take part in other ways. We'll be involved in campaigns. We'll go to those rubber chicken dinners, shaking babies and kissing hands. I mean, shaking hands and kissing babies. But the idea is we're much more involved on that approach than we are anywhere else. And this really defines our demographics, or the labels that make us up in terms of who we are and how we vote. These population characteristics that are here. If you think of demographics, you think labels. The whole idea of demographics is the types of things that define us, just like labels define what our clothes are made of. Are they made of cotton? Are they made of polyester? Are they made of different products? These demographics do define us, just like the makeup of clothes on the label define what types of clothes we have. So this is so important because it's based on age. It's based on race, on gender, education, our income, where we are, where we live in the country. Are we living in an urban setting or a more city setting, or are we rural? We live on farms. We live in farm country, or maybe it's in the suburbs or the exurbs, not far outside the city, but very suburban in that nature. All of these things really help to shape who we are, and more importantly, how we vote as these characteristics. Now remember, socialization really about the family that shaped these attitudes, and we learn this as children, which is why these demographics are so important, because we've gotten these values. By the time you're in this class, a lot of these have already been set. Your age will define you as you get older, and that will help to define the types of ideology you have, but there's a lot of other factors that weigh into that as well, and we're going to take a look at those. Now, when these factors tend to shape and basically continue to shape who we are, we call these reinforcing cleavages. The idea that they do shape us in terms of how we vote, but we can see a white Protestant male is reinforcing. These are three groups, white individuals, Protestant individuals, and male individuals, that tend to reinforce each other in terms of how they vote. They're very reinforcing because they strengthen each other. They show us that this is the way that they tend to vote. And these three categories, these three demographics, tend to vote more conservative, and they vote more Republican in nature. Now, there could be other factors that will shape that in terms of how a person votes based on whether they live in an urban setting that could what we call cross-cut those cleavages that could change that. And a great example here is a black Protestant female. So here we have African Americans tend to vote more democratically, but Protestants don't. They tend to vote more conservatively. But females tend to vote more liberally, more democratic. So this is what we call cross-cutting. And if you're a member of one group, but then a member of another group, it's harder to define how that person may vote. So we can't really define it based on what we see here. Sometimes they may vote more conservatively, sometimes more democratically. And this is where Anthony Downs and Downs' theory of rational choice really comes in, because it's a cross-cutting cleavage that swings to the left to vote for Democrats, swings to the right to vote for Republicans, and these are the voters that tend to shift elections and swing them to one party or another. Now let's shift and talk about de Tocqueville for a second, because he came here, I told you, to talk about and to write a research paper or a report on the penitentiary system, the prison system in America at the time. But his real passion was about why democracy was so successful here. And there were many things that he came up with. Abundant and fertile soil, there was lots of opportunity for people to create farms and grow land. There was no aristocracy. There was a class that tended to be the more informed and tended to be the more legislatively astute and involved, but there was a very independent spirit about it all. And there was a barrier. Foreigners couldn't get here, let alone invade the country, so it really created that really nice barrier for the country to be able to grow and thrive. And what we saw here was this idea of American exceptionalism. The quote that had been adapted over time, "America is great because America is good," that really wasn't him at all, as we talked about in class. But the idea here was that there was lots of opportunity and lots of growth, and people were able to take advantage of that. And they were able to see beyond just the religion aspect, or just the economic aspect, or just the social aspect. And they were able to look broader at the freedoms that they had, and valuing these parts of the political culture more so than the ideological or demographic differences. The idea here in terms of what we're seeing is de Tocqueville still at work in terms of democracy in America today. The changes since the last election, we see people moving out of these areas of the Midwest and the Rust Belt and the Midwest that we see here. The Rust Belt being kind of up here in the Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania areas that voted for President Trump, and out of the Midwestern areas, and they tend to be moving more in the South. We see, Texas picking up a number of seats, and Florida, Louisiana an exception because of New Orleans and Hurricane Katrina. They lost a seat, but what we call the Sun Belt, this real idea of the South really picking up a number of seats, and an outlier up there in Washington. But the idea here is that we continue to change and grow, and people are moving south and west as a result of the opportunities that they seek and what's available. And this is exactly what de Tocqueville was talking about in Democracy in America. Look at the differences. We see red, we see blue. Blue tend to be more associated with liberal or democratic voters in terms of how they're voting, not the voters themselves, and then more of the red. Now look, this is an election in which President Obama won pretty significantly. But we can see a lot of red in more rural areas, thus underscoring the demographics, the ideologies that rural voters tend to be more conservative, and that urban voters and ex-urban in this case, the ex-urban, the people living outside of cities in suburbs, but just outside the cities, in this election swung to the left and helped elect Barack Obama, the first African-American president. But we also saw in 2016 those ex-urban voters voted for Donald Trump in the 2016 election, swinging the Electoral College to Donald Trump. So we can see here some regional differences, but it really defines the demographics and the ideological differences that we're talking about here in terms of that urban versus rural, and the suburban really being that middle of the road voter that's swinging to the left, swinging to the right, and swinging elections to the Democrats or to the Republicans. Now, In terms of some regional differences, the South, the Midwest, the Plain States, as I mentioned, tend to be more conservative. We see more liberal or Democratic voters in the Northeast, in the West or the Pacific Northwest, and even in the Upper Midwest, in more urban centers like Chicago or Madison or Milwaukee. Those tend to be more Democratic in nature. The South, such as Texas or Florida, even North Carolina, Georgia, the southern states, tend to be more conservative. They tend to vote with Republicans more. And the plain states definitely. We see with Iowa, with Nebraska, with Missouri, and Wyoming, Colorado, starting to change, but still tending to vote more conservatively with Republicans. So we definitely see some ideological differences at work there in terms of demographics. Now, looking at regional differences among demographics and racial and ethnicity demographic changes. 95% of the African American vote went to President Obama for obvious reasons. He is African American. But notice conservatives tend to vote, Asian Americans tend to vote more conservatively. Hispanics or Latinos tend to vote more liberally, where Cuban Americans are really the exception in terms of voting more conservatively with Republicans. Native Americans tend to be more democratic, tend to support more economic programs to help level the playing field because they benefit from that. And then white and Caucasian Americans tend to vote more conservatively with Republicans in that aspect. And this has kind of played out, again, Downs' theory of rational choice, swinging to the left or swinging to the right. But the idea here is that those voters, those demographics, tend to cling to the conservatives or liberals pretty much a lot of the time. Now, if there's a cross-cutting cleavage in which, as I mentioned, we have a Protestant that tends to vote more conservatively, but they're African American that tends to vote more liberally, it's really hard to tell how that voter is going to swing. Likewise, if you see a white voter that is in an urban setting, they may be, being white may be more conservative, but in an urban setting being more liberal, it's a cross-cutting cleavage again, and we really don't know how they may vote. But we can at least take a look at, again, because we're trying to generalize for an entire 300 million population of a country, we can pretty much narrow it down to that and make those differences. Hispanics, as I mentioned, tend to vote Democratic. The exception to that is Cuban Americans. They tend to vote more conservatively. President Obama got 2/3 of the Hispanic vote in 2008. We call them the sleeping giant because the turnout tends to be low. Hillary Clinton did tend to get more of the vote there, but a significant number, I believe, to the point of like, I don't know, 28% of Hispanic voters did turn out for President Trump in the 2016 election. Asian Americans, again, not monolithic. Japanese Americans more likely to be Democrats. Asian Americans tend to be more conservative in nature. But again, it's going to impact not just on race or ethnicity, but on other factors such as education, such as income, such as their geography, whether they're urban in an urban setting or in a rural setting. That political participation is going to matter. And that is the cross-cutting cleavage we talk about there. Religion. Also tending to break down in the conservative-liberal dichotomy. Protestants more conservative, Catholics and Jewish people tend to be more liberal, and Mormons tend to be more conservative. And again, those are cross-cutting if there's other factors that weigh into that, and that really makes the difference here. In terms of those religions, we still see Protestants as the majority, 51%, the more than any other, tend to be Protestants in America today, and that has continue to play out. A number of other religions that you see there as well. Roman Catholics, Christian and Jewish and Buddhism and Muslims weighing out, but the majority tend to be Protestants in that camp. So they tend to vote more conservatively, as we saw there in the previous slide. Demographics of gender, the gender gap. Men tend to vote more conservative, women more liberal, and until the last 30 years, there really wasn't a difference in this, and this has really created what we call a gender gap between the parties. We saw that women came out to vote more for Hillary Clinton, obviously being a gender factor. But the gender gap, they tend to vote more for Democrats, and they did for President Obama. Women tended to vote more for President Obama than men did, voting more conservatively for Mitt Romney and John McCain in the 2012 and 2008 elections, respectively. Family structure, again, tending to be less traditional over the last 50 years. Higher rate of divorce, higher rate of single parent homes. Higher education tends to also align with that higher level of political participation. We tend to see those that are more educated tend to vote more liberally. Those that are less educated tend to vote more conservatively. And again, that breaks down here, and I'll break that down in a second in terms of income. But the higher income tend to vote, the wealthier tend to vote more conservatively in terms of cutting the taxes and keeping government out of that aspect. And then age has a factor as well. The whole idea here of older voters tend to like Social Security, but that's really the only aspect they want government involvement. Otherwise, they tend to vote much more conservatively than younger voters do. But they're also more reliable in voting because they make a big deal about getting out to vote, and they tend to have more influence in politics as a result of it. So, the American political system, what do we value as part of the political culture? We value liberty, equality, democracy, individual responsibility, civic duty, but how these play out are very different in terms of how we go about legislating this. Liberals tend to say it's more the economic aspect of equality and individual responsibility. We need to level the playing field. Conservatives say, no, it's not about that. It's about the social aspect of legislating morality, less so about economic. Get government out of the way so that business can hire workers and create jobs. And that's really the key difference between the two in terms of political culture. We all value these things, but how we go about legislating them is very, very different. So, bonus, what unifies the United States today, and what do we continue to see from de Tocqueville's time? We see that we have a shared commitment to democratic values. How we carry that out is different, but we do share the commitment. Also, a commitment to economic opportunity. Again, how we carry that out, Democrats, liberals want to level the playing field. Conservatives and Republicans tend to want to get government out of the way, so it frees businesses to create those jobs and that economic opportunity. So very different about how we go about it, but we do tend to value economic opportunity. We just have different viewpoints about how we go about doing so. We value a work ethic, that Protestant work ethic we talked about in the last chapter, and sharing the American dream, that idea of education, economic, and social mobility. All of these are unifying factors, and especially as part of our national identity after World War II. All of this playing into the importance that bringing the country together from that patriotism, especially after something like 9/11 that really tries to draw the country together. That's the end of Chapter 5. I hope you found this helpful with ideologies and demographics. Good luck on the quiz, test, or exam, and live the 5.